security for their future submission, they were required to give up to the Romans 300 hostages. These hostages were to be young persons from the first families in Carthage, the sons of the men who were the most prominent in society there, and whose influence might be supposed to control the action of a nation. The ambassadors could not but consider these as very onerous terms. They did not know what orders the consuls would give them on their arrival in Africa, and they were required to put the commonwealth wholly into their power. Besides, in the guarantee which the Romans offered them, their territories and their laws were to be protected, but nothing was said of their cities, their ships, of their arms and munitions of war. The agreement there, if executed, would put the Carthaginian commonwealth wholly at the mercy of their masters in respect to all those things which were in those days most valuable to a nation as elements of power. Still, the ambassadors had been instructed to make peace with the Romans on any terms, and they accordingly acceded to those, though with great reluctance. They were especially adverse to the agreement in respect to the hostages. This system, which prevailed universally in ancient times, of having the government of one nation surrender the children of the most distinguished citizens to that of another as security for the fulfillment of its treaty stipulations, was a very cruel hardship to those who had to suffer the separation. But it would seem that there was no other security strong enough to hold such lawless powers as governments were in those days to their word. Stern and rough as the men of those warlike nations often were, mothers were the same then as now, and they suffered quite as keenly in seeing their children sent away from them, to pine in a foreign land, in hopeless exile for many years, in danger, too, continually of the most cruel treatment, and even death itself, to revenge some alleged governmental wrong. Of course, the ambassadors knew, when they returned to Carthage with these terms, that they were bringing heavy tidings. The news, in fact, when it came, threw the community into the most extreme distress. It is said that the whole city was filled with cries and lamentations. The mothers, who felt that they were about to be bereaved, beat their breasts and tore their hair, and manifested by every other sign their extreme and unmitigated woe. They begged and entreated their husbands and fathers not to consent to such cruel and intolerable conditions. They could not, and they would not, give up their children. The husbands and the fathers, however, felt compelled to resist all these entreaties. They could not now undertake to resist the Roman will. Their army had been well nigh destroyed in the battle with Massinissa. Their city was consequently defenseless, and the Roman fleet had already reached its African port, and the troops were landed. There was no possible way, it appeared, of saving themselves and their city from absolute destruction, but entire submission to the terms which their stern conquerors had imposed upon them. The hostages were required to be sent, within 30 days, to the island of Sicily, to a port on the western extremity of the island, called Lilybaeum. Lilybaeum was the port in Sicily nearest to Carthage, being perhaps at a distance of 100 miles across the waters of the Mediterranean Sea. A Roman escort was to be ready to receive them there and conduct them to Rome. Although 30 days were allowed to the Carthaginians to select and send forward the hostages, they determined not to avail themselves of this offered delay, but to send the unhappy children forward at once, that they might testify to the Roman Senate by this their promptness, that they were very earnestly desirous to propitiate their favor. The children were accordingly designated, one from each of the leading families in the city, and 300 in all. The reader must imagine the heart-rending scenes of suffering that must have desolated these 300 families and homes, when the stern and inexorable edict came to each of them that one loved member of the household must be selected to go, and when at last the hour arrived for their departure, and they assembled upon the pier, the picture was one of intense and unmingled suffering. The poor exiles stood bewildered with terror and grief, about to part with all they had ever held dear, their parents, their brothers and sisters, and their native land, to go they knew not whither, under the care of iron-hearted soldiers, who seemed to know no feelings of tenderness or compassion for their woes. Their disconsolate mothers wept and groaned aloud, clasping the loved ones who were about to be torn forever from them in their arms. In a delirium of maternal affection and irrepressible grief, their brothers and sisters and their youthful friends stood by, some almost frantic with emotions which they did not attempt to suppress, others mute and motionless in their sorrow, shedding bitter tears of anguish, or gazing wildly on the scene with looks of despair, while the fathers, whose stern duty it was to pass through this scene unmoved, walked to and fro restlessly, in deep but silent distress, spoke in broken and incoherent words to one another, and finally aided by a mixture of persuasion and gentle force in drawing the children away from their mother's arms, and getting them on board the vessels which were to convey them away. The vessels made sail, and passed off slowly from the shore. The mothers watched them till they could no longer be seen, and then returned, disconsolate and wretched, to their homes. And then the grief and agitation of this parting scene was succeeded by the anxious suspense which now pervaded the whole city, to learn what new dangers and indignities they were to suffer from the approaching Roman army, which they knew must now be well on its way. The Roman army landed at Utica. Utica was a large city to the north of Carthage, not far from it, and upon the same bay. When the people of Utica found that another serious collision was to take place between Rome and Carthage, they had foreseen what would probably be the end of the contest, and they had decided that, in order to save themselves from the ruin which was plainly impending over the sister city, they must abandon her to her fate, and make common cause with Rome. They had accordingly sent deputies to the Roman Senate, offering to surrender Utica to their power. The Romans had accepted the submission, and had made this city in consequence the port of debarkation for their army. As soon as the news arrived at Carthage that the Roman army had landed at Utica, the people sent deputies to inquire what were the orders of the consuls, for it will be recollected they had bound themselves by the treaty to obey the orders which the consuls were to bring. They found, when they arrived there, that the bay was covered with the Roman shipping. There were 50 vessels of war, of 3 banks of oars each, and a vast number of transports besides. There was, too, in the camp upon the shore, a force of 80,000 foot soldiers and 4,000 horse, all armed and equipped in the most perfect manner. The deputies were convinced that this was a force which it was in vain for their countrymen to think of resisting. They asked, trembling, for the consul's orders. The consuls informed them that the orders of the Roman Senate were, first, that the Carthaginians should furnish them with a supply of corn for the subsistence of their troops. The deputies went back to Carthage with the demand. The Carthaginians resolved to comply. They were bound by their treaty and by the hostages they had given, as well as intimidated by the presence of the Roman force. They furnished the corn. The consuls, soon after this, made another demand on the Carthaginians. It was that they should surrender to them all their vessels of war. They were more unwilling to comply with this requisition than the other, but they assented at last. They hoped that the demands of their enemies would stop here, and that, satisfied with having weakened them thus far, they would go away and leave them. They could then build new ships again when better times should return. But the Romans were not satisfied yet. They sent a third order, that the Carthaginians should deliver up all their arms, military stores, and warlike machines of every kind, by sending them into the Roman camp. The Carthaginians were rendered almost desperate by this requisition. Many were determined that they would not submit to it, but would resist at all hazards. others despaired of all possibility of